Welcome to the Museum of Anthropology. We are here on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, who are our kind hosts. My name is Jennifer Kramer. I'm one of the curators responsible for the First Nations Northwest Coast collections here at the Museum of Anthropology. And it's my privilege to be touring you through our most recent temporary exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience, excerpts from the memoirs of Miss Chief Eagle Testickle, curated by Cree artist Kent Monkman. It's my honor to tour you through this exhibition, and there will be time for questions that you can ask at the end of this virtual tour. But I also want to make sure that you are aware that this exhibition is open to the public until January 3rd, 2021. So we hope if you are in the area that you come by and see it for yourself. This exhibition was actually created when Barbara Fisher, the director and CEO of the Art Gallery of the University of Toronto, invited Kent Monkman to respond to the Canada 150 celebrations that were being funded in 2015. This was at exactly the same time that the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action came out. And Kent Monkman, who's a Cree artist who lives in Toronto but was raised in Winnipeg, wanted to respond to the celebrations. From an Indigenous perspective, perhaps celebrating the creation of Canada was not the first desire. So what he did was he was funded with Barbara Fisher. They traveled across Canada to look at collections in museums across the country and to select historical objects to use in this exhibition and to tell the history of Canada's creation, starting back 300 years ago in the 18th century with the founding of New France, and then going all the way up to the present. Kent Monkman uses his alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testickle, who he describes as a time-traveling, trickster, gender-bending, supernatural being. And you're going to see that this exhibition is laid out as excerpted chapters from Miss Chief's memoirs. So why don't we go in and start in the first chapter, New France, Reign of the Beaver. So I'm going to walk us through all 9 chapters of this exhibition, taken from the memoirs of Miss Chief Eagle Testickle. But first I want to start on an overarching series of themes that you're going to be hearing about throughout the exhibition. The first is the theme of abundance and wealth and riches that are provided by these lands that are now known as Canada, but have been the ancestral home of Indigenous peoples for thousands and thousands of years. So the first theme is the abundance, the plethora of resources, animal, flora, fauna that are available to us here on these lands. And then its opposition, the taking of these resources, the extraction of these resources, and the movement into poverty and starvation. And I will be talking about that in the second chapter. Another main theme is a theme of moving from illness or sickness into health and wellness. So from experiencing many of the traumas of colonialism, and that would include smallpox and influenza, all the way up to present-day ills of tuberculosis and HIV, and then into resilience and healing, Indigenous health and well-being. Another theme that you're going to see throughout this exhibition is spirituality, both Christian and Indigenous spirituality. And you're going to see both of them playing out throughout the exhibition. So those 3 themes are very strong throughout, so keep your eye peeled for that. So we're starting in chapter 1, New France, Reign of the Beaver. And what you see to my right is the first installation by Kent Monkman called Scent of a Beaver. And some of you might recognize what we're seeing is Miss Chief herself on a swing, wearing beautiful buckskin and beaver with embroidery from a very French fashion, moccasins beaded, between General Wolfe and General Montcalm. And this is a taking of a very well-known painting by Jean-Honoré Fragonard called The Swing, where a woman swings back and forth between her two suitors in Rococo France. And so what Kent Monkman has done is he's replayed this painting as an installation between two generals, British General Wolfe and French General Montcalm, who fought on the Plains of Abraham in the 18th century to control the lands that would become Canada. And so this was a very famous battle where actually, even though technically the British won and ended up getting control of Canada, both of these generals died as a result of injuries on the Plains of Abraham. But what's most important here, and what Kent Monkman wants us to know, is that when the original fur traders came from France and from England to colonize, to extract resources such as beaver from these lands, who was in charge? Well, actually, Indigenous people were in charge. And so here, Miss Chief is talking about being wooed by both the French and the British for her favors, and being wooed because the fur trading industry was actually very much created by Indigenous hunters. And so here on my left, you see a painting called The Massacre of Innocents. And Kent Monkman has used another very common theme in classical history representational painting to tell the story of a massacre. But instead of the expected Greek or Roman deaths that we see, what we're seeing, and I hope the cameras are zooming in, are Indigenous and non-Indigenous fur hunters killing beaver for their fur. And you might not know, but in the 18th century, not only was the beaver pelts, the inner pelts, used to create these incredible hats in Europe, but also the castoreum, the oil of the beaver, was used to make perfume. And if you zoom in even closer, you'll see that Miss Chief is in the lower left corner, and she's carrying a beaver, almost as if when you first look at it, it looks like she's suckling a baby, but actually she's carrying a beaver like her child. And Kent Monkman told us that in Cree, the word for beaver actually means brethren. They're our family. And so Kent Monkman is making the point that while European fur traders came in under such companies as the Hudson Bay Company to extract as many resources as they could from the lands, Indigenous people didn't think of the flora and the fauna as resources. They thought about them as family. And that's another theme that you're going to see throughout this exhibition, that Miss Chief is all about family and love. So we're in the second chapter, and it is called Starvation. And so here you're seeing the movement historically from 18th century in what the Europeans called the New World, which they considered a wilderness, empty and ripe for extracting resources, for becoming wealthy. But then you're seeing the results of that way of thinking, and you're seeing it in chapter 2, Starvation. And Kent Monkman is basically explaining what happened when settlers, when the British started claiming the lands and started moving west. The main installation in this chapter is called the Starvation Table. This was created by Kent Monkman. And here what you're seeing, if you look up close, is you're seeing a beautiful table, like fancy mahogany with lace laid out with Canadian silverware, brass candlesticks, candelabras, champagne in the glasses, salmon and other delicious foods, grapes, and you're seeing the bounty of the land as the Europeans thought about the New World, ready to make them wealthy. And as they pushed west, the idea was that modernity was going to bring them resources. And so as this table moves, it goes from a lot of this beautiful tableware, which Kent Monkman selected from places like the Canadian Museum of History or the Glenbow Museum, and it moves on to the end where what you see are empty plates only filled with buffalo or bison bones. And this signifies the fact that the riches that were planned by the settlers when they settled this land were not shared with the Indigenous people of this land. So this painting that represents this idea that Kent Monkman is trying to get across is called The Iron Horse. And as you can see, it's a play on the story of the Trojan horse of Troy. And what you're seeing are Indigenous people pulling in an iron horse along a new railroad that's being laid. And the railroad for Kent Monkman symbolizes, and for the settlers as well, symbolized this idea of moving into modernity and all the riches and wealth that the modern world was going to offer the settlers. But this is a Trojan horse because the story is actually one of famine and being incarcerated onto reserves and being put into Indian residential schools. And so as we walk to the end, you see Kent Monkman has created plates which have transfers of archival images of the piles of bison bones that were shot by settlers, to the point where Indigenous people starved to death because being put onto reserves and not having access to their main food on the plains caused them to starve, to put it bluntly. So here we are on the end of the Starvation table installation, and we've moved from these valued museum objects, treasures that feed the European settlers, and we've moved to these plates, which Kent Monkman has called the Starvation plates and also the Resilience plate. But on these plates are archival photographs taken in the 19th century of piles of bison bones. And basically the buffalo or the bison were decimated. Sometimes they were even shot by this kind of rifle out of the window of railroads, of railroad trains. And what this caused was a huge famine for Indigenous people on the plains, and it forced them into a position of basically needing to give up their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, because they were starving. And you're going to see this theme played out, this forcible incarceration onto reserves, onto Indian residential schools, and eventually, as in nowadays, into prisons. The other theme that Kent Monkman is commenting on is Western painters such as George Catlin or Paul Kane, who envisioned the West, this place of new opportunity for Europeans or Euro-Canadians, as a place where the Indian was disappearing, was vanishing, was not able to keep up with modernity. And he very much wants to undermine this stereotype. And so what you're going to see, he's taken some prints and some paintings of people like George Catlin at the end, this image of buffalo dance on the plains, and you're going to see him showing it incorporated throughout the exhibit to show that really Indigenous people are resilient. They did not disappear, and they certainly were not the vanishing Indian who couldn't live in modern times. Chapter 3 is called The Fathers of Confederation. And behind me, what you can see is the iconic image of this exhibition. It's called The Daddies. Basically, it was inspired by the meeting of the Fathers of Confederation, where they first floated and founded the idea of Canada becoming Canada in Charlottetown in PEI in 1864. And there's a classic Robert Harris painting that was painted to represent all of the founding fathers in PEI. What you see behind me is Kent Monkman's redoing of this classic painting of the founding of fathers. And what he's done is he's placed Miss Chief Eagle Testickle into the center of the painting. And to those of you that know the original painting, there actually is a stool right in the middle where Miss Chief has been put by Kent Monkman. And Kent said, this is ridiculous. How can these soon-to-be Euro-Canadian settlers found this nation without including the Indigenous people of these lands who have governed these lands for generations and generations? So he's inserted Miss Chief, naked except for her Louboutin high heels, sitting on a Hudson Bay Company blanket on top of a Chateau Miss Chief wine case, facing the shocked and titillated eyes of the Fathers of Confederation. And one of the things you'll notice is that throughout this exhibition, Kent Monkman has an entire studio that he works with, studio of painters. And so he started a new way of creating these monumental history paintings that are representational. He very much uses real portraits of real people. So for this painting, he actually did research, and each of the faces represents individuals who were at this moment for the founding of for the founding of Canada. And then inserting Miss Chief naked and calling it the daddies. Of course, the daddies are either your sugar daddies that give you funding to keep your lifestyle, or they're maybe your pimps. So he's talking about this relationship, and he's using another theme that you're going to see throughout this exhibition is Miss Chief's sexuality and Indigenous sexuality, and a sexuality that is not binary, that doesn't have to be male or female. And Kent Monkman is very much playing on the strength of this sexuality to speak back to what he sees as a very patriarchal, male-dominated Christian way of thinking that is the founding of Canada. So here, Miss Chief, whether she's showing her junk or her beaver to the Fathers of Confederation, she's doing her best to unsettle them. This next section of this exhibition, I think, is the most difficult. It's called The Forcible Transfer of Children. And what you see behind me is probably Kent Monkman's most powerful painting in this exhibition, and it's called The Scream. And it's about the taking of Indigenous children to Indian residential schools. Kent Monkman felt in doing this exhibition that the history of the colonial violence perpetuated on Indigenous bodies, on children, on women, on men, on non-binary spirits, are not represented in the museums in Canada. And how can this important history be ignored or not taught? So The Scream, I believe, is the largest painting in this exhibition. So big, it can't be hidden away about what happened. And what you also see on the walls are painted black, and what you see on either side are cradle boards that were used by Indigenous people, many different cultures, different forms, to carry their children, their babies, on their backs. And many of these cradle boards are, well, all the cradle boards are empty, but there are also images that look like tombstones and images that look like chalk outlines, like a police murder scene, basically making the point visually that so many thousands of children went to residential schools and thousands never came back home again. So this is really the most difficult chapter, and one of the things I haven't pointed out is that the excerpts of the memoirs of Miss Chief are the main labels for each of the chapters, and you can buy these excerpted memoirs, but also they're the labels, and this label, which is printed on our walls in English, French, and Cree syllabics, Miss Chief just says, "This is the one I cannot talk about. The pain is too deep. We were never the same." And I'll just leave this chapter at that. The next chapter is called Wards of the State, the Indian Problem. And this basically documents all of the legalities that the Canadian government passed in order to virtually incarcerate Indigenous peoples. So the Indian Act that made Indigenous people officially Indians, and therefore the wards of the government of Canada. Put them onto reserves, put their children into residential schools, and often ended up with incarceration of Indigenous bodies in prisons. What you see behind me is actually, I think, my personal favorite painting. It's called A Country Wife. And I hadn't realized this before I heard this from Kent Monkman, but a country wife is actually the term that a fur trader settler would use to describe his Indigenous wife that he took when he came here from Britain. And then when his European wife showed up, or when he decided to marry a European British woman, he would just dump his country wife. So it really explains the violence of how Indigenous people, how their lands were both embraced and then thrown away. And what you're seeing behind me is Miss Chief dressed up, and I don't know if you've got this reference. The title of the exhibition is Shame and Prejudice, and this is a reference to Elizabeth Bennet in the book Pride and Prejudice, which is a novel that Kent Monkman really loves. And of course you're seeing, the phrase is, if a man has a big inheritance, he's going to be in need of a wife. But what you're seeing is Miss Chief wanting to marry Sir John A. Macdonald, and her mascara is running because, of course, he's already married, and of course he treats her abominably. But you're getting at this very personal, very familial, you're getting at Miss Chief wanting to be loved and wanting to be in partnership with the peoples that have come into her home and into her land. So I think that's a very powerful exhibit, a very powerful painting in the exhibit. The painting on my left, also in this chapter, is called The Subjugation of Truth. And what I love about this painting, it never existed as a history painting, a Canadian history painting. But what it is putting into a historical memory for Canada is the signing of Treaty 6 in Manitoba with Chief Poundmaker and Chief Big Bear and the country of Canada. And above them, you see what should be Queen Victoria. But of course, what it is, if you look up close, is Miss Chief dressed up as Queen Victoria, or even Kent Monkman as Miss Chief dressed up as Queen Victoria. And so you're getting what this entire exhibit is about, which is returning the colonial gaze, turning back the vision that Euro-Canadian settlers had and have of Indigenous peoples as maybe part of the wilderness, or dying out, or from the past, or lacking power and control. And he's changing that image around. And now he's Queen Victoria, the ultimate queen of the situation. But he's also depicting these real-life chiefs, leaders of people from the plains who were basically forced to sign treaty because their people were starving. And not only that, at the time that this was signed, both Poundmaker and Big Bear had been incarcerated in Mount Stoney Penitentiary for being part of what was known then as the Riel Rebellion. So the Métis Rebellion that tried to take back the lands in Manitoba for Indigenous people. And what I find especially empowering about this painting, and if you come to the exhibit, you'll see there's photographs of Poundmaker and Big Bear in prison, and you'll also see Poundmaker's moccasins, evidence of his real life, that he was there to protect his people. Is that in, I believe it was 2016, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau exonerated Poundmaker and Big Bear and said that they were not treasonous for resisting Canada, that they were actually peaceful leaders defending their people. And I think that's really important, that we're starting to re-see this history. We're in the chapter called Incarceration. And of course, as I've explained throughout, there are many examples of the incarceration of Indigenous bodies throughout the 300-year history as we get up to the present. And of course, there still are far too many Indigenous bodies incarcerated in prisons today in Canada. I believe Indigenous people make up 4% of Canada's population, and they're 30% in the prison system. So what you're seeing in this installation, it's called minimalism. And of course, it's also Kent Monkman making his critique of modern art. He very much loves the classic representational history paintings that he's been using that genre throughout this exhibit to re-embed Indigenous perspectives on the history of Indigenous Canadian relations through representational painting. And so minimalism is his critique in this incarceration, in this installation of Miss Chief incarcerated in prison, but also Miss Chief as Leonard Peltier, who is an American Indian movement warrior who has been incarcerated in prison in the United States since the 60s, when he was probably incorrectly accused of killing 2 FBI agents, and he's been in prison his entire life. And you'll see later on in the exhibit, you'll see free LP, free Leonard Peltier. So you get these references, these real things about real people that have happened throughout the exhibition. The other thing that Kent Monkman talks about incarceration is that, ironically, many Indigenous people discover Indigenous spirituality when they're in prison. That's when they have time to meet with Indigenous elders and to learn about smudging and about sweat lodges and other means for Indigenous resilience and health and spirituality. The other painting or the other artwork by Kent Monkman in this exhibition I absolutely love. It's called Reincarceration. And if you look at it closely, what you see is you've got that typical sort of open wilderness kind of artwork that we're seeing in the West by people like Paul Kane, Albert Bierstadt. But what you're seeing is the Mount Stoney Penitentiary in the background, and you're seeing Indigenous people leaving the penitentiary depicted as Giacometti sculptures. And that's another modern artist who created these sculptures of human beings, kind of like skeletons, very, very skeletal. And they're walking across the water, and they're joining this circle of sun dancers. And then on the sides of them are these old rusty cars. So reincarceration, we're getting rebirth and renewal, and we're getting out of incarceration. And I remember when Kent Monkman spoke about this piece, he said, you might think that these rusty old cars are a sign of garbage or of loss of hope. But actually, when you're on a reserve in the prairies, like outside of Winnipeg, where he's from, in northern Winnipeg, northern Manitoba, these res cars, as he calls them, were your only means to get off the reserve. So these are another means for renewal and for rebirth. We're in the chapter called The Res House, and here you can see the installation of a drafty, substandard res house, but what you're seeing is basically another version of the birth of the baby Jesus, with Mary on the left and Joseph on the right, but they're all wearing the face of Kent Monkman, including the baby, sitting on a Hudson Bay Company blanket. And as well, this is also an interpretation of Miss Chief Eagle Testickle being born to her loving parents. And so you're seeing this layering of meaning, of Christian meaning, of the real practicalities of what life is like on reserve right now in Canada. So you see the bottled water, because so many reserves do not have healthy drinking water. You see the substandard food like Kraft Dinner and Spam and tomato soup. You see Mary with her rosary that was actually created by Kent Monkman with a beaver on the cross as Jesus. And you may wonder, why is the face of Kent Monkman or Miss Chief on all of these people? Kent Monkman talked about visiting the American Museum of Natural History in New York City years ago and being shocked that every single life representation of Indigenous people had the same face on it again and again and again, this stereotyping of Indigenous people as if they were some kind of abstract non-individuals. So he's replaying that, sort of returning the gaze by putting his own face in this scene. And this installation of the Res House also has the words Amor Vincit Omnia, which in Latin means love conquers all. And it's supposed to be really the theme of Christianity. And you can see these kind of stained glass-like windows in this frame with the beaver with wings on it. That sort of, Kent Monkman plays with this idea of angels and angels, beavers with angels, Indigenous spirituality and Christianity, and what does that mean and what has it brought for Indigenous people. And so you can see it in this chapter. We're in the chapter titled Sickness and Healing. And I think it's very appropriate actually to talk about this chapter now during the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all experiencing. So one of the things that's been made abundantly clear to me is that Indigenous people in Canada have had a lot of experience with plagues. So you see Miss Chief saying right here, I remember the first catastrophes, the dark days of the epidemics. We had no resistance to the European plagues of smallpox, influenza, and measles that ravaged our communities. But then at the end of her statement, she says, I visit my people to bring them the solace of our spirituality, that they may rise up out of this cycle of destruction, learn the language of their souls, and be free once more. So here you have Kent Monkman talking about these themes of sickness and healing, Indigenous resilience, rebirth, strengthening through bringing their language back, strengthening through learning their spirituality. And this painting is called The Death of the Virgin after Caravaggio. And Caravaggio has a very famous painting of the death of the Virgin Mary, but here Kent Monkman has put a trans person in a hospital bed, a contemporary hospital bed. We don't know whether they have passed away due to suicide, due to AIDS, due to overdose, all problems that we're experiencing here. But what you see surrounding this person is the love of their family, Indigenous spirituality. And so Kent Monkman is balancing this, the strength of Indigenous spirituality, Christianity, different types of healing. The final chapter in this exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience, is called The Urban Res. And here Kent Monkman has depicted the streets of the north end of his home, where he was raised in Winnipeg, which is most by population Indigenous. And he's telling many, many layers and stories in these monumental paintings. He's combining the real streets, the real houses, the real BC hydro poles, but he's showing them, for example, depicted as First Nations Northwest Coast totem poles, or he's showing, for example, in this painting called Seeing Red, and he has such wonderful titles to his paintings, you get Miss Chief as a bullfighter, carrying a Hudson Bay Company blanket in all of her beautiful Athabascan beaded gear, and of course her Louboutin high heels, fighting not a bull, but a bison, and a bison that looks a lot like the way perhaps Picasso would have depicted a bison. And Kent Monkman is very much critiquing again the ideas of modern art, saying that they don't represent people fully, in fact, that they flatten people. And we'll see, if you look at other paintings in this series, that he's created women flattened in Picasso Cubist style to show that they've been kind of pushed, flattened out of their strength. And so here is Picasso, who saw himself very much as a bull, depicted himself as a bull, and very misogynist in Kent Monkman's. So here is Miss Chief fighting this Picasso bull. And then you get an angel, or perhaps Mercury, god of war, but also looking a bit angelic with the wings, flowing down onto this moment with lots of things happening. There's a deceased bullfighter, we think, down here in the corner. There are the buffalo dance that we saw in the second chapter, Starvation, that George Catlin interpreted, but you've got them here coming back into this real-life contemporary scene. So again, Kent Monkman is layering this meaning, referencing old paintings that stereotyped Indigenous people as perhaps vanishing or as leaving these lands, not able to deal with modernity. And instead, Kent Monkman is saying, no, contemporary life, Indigenous people are here, and they can pull back all the way to their past cultures, all the way into the present. They're fully modern. In other paintings in this series, they're wearing very luxury brand clothing, bags or fancy shoes. So you're seeing full contemporary lives. And you're also seeing lots of use of Indigenous regalia, Indigenous spirituality, and Christianity, angels, and animals as well, like bears and eagles coming down to rescue. So all of that is coming to play in the Urban Res series. And I'll end it here. You have to come and see it yourself because there are 4 incredible paintings in the Urban Res series, but they're layered with meaning. They show the realities of Indigenous lives in Canada, but they also reference all these history paintings, all these themes of plenty and poverty, these themes of Indigenous spirituality and Christianity, these themes of sexuality as something to celebrate, Indigenous sexuality. And I'm going to end it there, but this story doesn't end. This exhibit is a response to Canada's 150 celebration, but it's also a response to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action in 2015 that say that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are responsible for reconciliation and restitution to what happened and is ongoing happening to Indigenous peoples here in this country. I'm happy to take questions.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Well, that was a beautiful, beautiful tour. This is actually really a privilege to be able to do this with Jennifer and Ria Saxena. This is our first online full-length tour during COVID. And I can see from the turnout that it's a really great idea for us to continue on this way. Thank you for everyone for being here. We are at full capacity. We'll have to let more than 300 people in next time. And Jennifer, congratulations. That was a really amazing tour.
Thank you. Strange to see yourself reflected back.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when you're sitting in your home. And I'm not sure if Ria's going to show herself, but Ria Saxena is the public programming assistant this season. And she did all of the videography, she did all of the editing, and I think she did an incredible job. So thank you, Ria. We're gonna take questions from the audience, and anybody who has them are they're gonna send them my way. So I'll just pick through them and find which ones seem to be the most popular. And I'll just get started with some questions myself. Jennifer, again, that was a really enlightening tour, even for somebody like myself who's been working with the curatorial team for over a year and a half now to bring this together. By the way, my name is Marie Wissner. I'm the curator of public programming engagement at MOA. I always forget to introduce myself. But yeah, it's obvious that you've given that tour a few times and you've been thinking about this a lot. So I wondered, I'm not sure who's in the audience this evening, but I was wondering if you might be able to go into a little bit more detail about some of the words that you use that might not be things that people are usually thinking about. So non-binary, the term non-binary, you use it when you're talking about Monkman's representation of himself in the painting as Miss Chief. So what exactly does non-binary mean? And how were these people treated in pre-colonial Indigenous communities?
Thanks for that question. It's really important, and it's really important to Kent Monkman because I've heard him speak about this. Kent really wants to share the multiple sexualities that were celebrated in pre-contact, pre-Euro-Canadian, Euro-American culture. And he does this throughout his work. I think he's at 25 years or something like that, more of his work. Those of you that have studied Indigenous cultures in the past or in the present know that really the idea that there are only 2 genders, male or female, is not one that was embraced by Indigenous peoples across these lands. Some of you might know, for example, the term Berdache. There are all kinds of specific examples of individuals who lived lives that were not one or the other, but that had multiple ways of thinking about who they were along either a scale or spent time in different types of clothing or different types of jobs. And I'm not the expert to define what non-binary means, but I think what Kent Monkman is offering us through all of his visual play, as well through his alter ego of Mischief, is the fact that we can all choose, that we shouldn't be limited to a more Christian idea that you have to be either all female or all male, and that it's really up to our own beautiful supernatural selves to embrace however we want to be. And he's looking back to pre-colonial times to say, it was easier then. And there's, for example, there's a painting, I'm forgetting the Dance of the Berdache, whether it was by George Catlin or Paul Kane, I can't remember. But he's, at the time, sorry. Phone ringing somehow. I can't mute it. Here we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Let's go back to meeting. I thought I turned that off. Anyway, so the original, this 19th century version was sort of along the same lines as those Euro-American, Euro-Canadian painters that were depicting primitive and maybe witchcraft and wild and uncivilized traditions, and seeing them as dying out or as disgusting and all these kind of judgments from Christianity. And so he redoes, I know he's redone a picture of the Dance of the Berdache as much more celebratory and to embrace these options and these freedoms that people had for thousands of years before the coming of colonizers. So you see that throughout this exhibit. And not only that, the Mischief's sexuality, her nudity, is her power.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very cool. And it's nice to see, personally, it's nice to see that this artwork, because this is actually a small collection of his work. He's constantly turning things out. It's and because he has such an enormous body of work, he's able to really narrow it down to, with this particular show, a very centralized idea. So he goes back and forth with different kinds of provocative imagery and context, but in this particular show, he's critiquing art history. He's critiquing the museum. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. As you can see, he actually uses and redeploys the genre of representational history painting. What you can see when you see the exhibit that you didn't see in the virtual tour is that he used this opportunity to select paintings, historical, mostly 19th century paintings about the history of Indigenous Canadian interactions. And then he unsettles them and redeploys them. And he does that because he says, how can it be that we have this wonderfully evocative and powerful genre of history painting that can tell these fabulous stories and keep them in people's national memories, and yet these absolutely significant histories of the violence enacted on Indigenous bodies, or for example, children being ripped away from their parents and taken to residential schools, are not on display in our museums in Canada. And so that's why he does these history paintings, by unsettling that idea that Indigenous people quietly died out, and instead shows this resilience, this power, this force, this pushback, this survival and more has been going on, and he's going to paint it in these paintings. And then he's very conscious that museums, as we all know, were birthed out of colonialism. and were originally national spaces for showing the spoils of colonization. But he's using the power of museums, and I'm really glad he is, to speak to across the country Canadian audience about these important messages and saying, well, we need to get Indigenous representations of our experiences of this history onto the walls of the museums in Canada. And so this has been traveling across Canada. This is the 9th and final stop. So we are really excited that it's here at the Museum of Anthropology.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. It's a good run. Yeah, okay, a couple more. So can you just speak to Monkman's process a little bit more in terms of how he is able to churn out all of this different work? Normally when an artist has a large body of work, they have a very specialized style. You can really tell their strokes from other people's strokes. Can you tell us a little bit more about his studio and some of the practices he uses to get these lifelike images?
Yeah, I touched on it briefly when we were talking about the daddies, but actually during the creation of this particular exhibit, Shame and Prejudice, he started a new process for this studio. And interestingly, we all know, we think of Renaissance studios about famous artists having this cadre of apprentices that worked with them to learn the art. Well, Kent Monkman has taken this on. And so now I'm trying to remember how many he told us. I think he has 20 people or 16 people working for him in his studio in Toronto. And that's everything from the people that arrange where he's going to show up and speak and do his travel tours, to the painters that are painting parts of his exhibits, to the people that are doing research on certain historical moments or art history. And so this new process that he developed was bringing in real people to model the paintings that he wants to make. And some of you may be aware, for a long time since before this particular exhibit, what he did was he took historic, already existing paintings and he reworked them. So he's very much playing, for example, the Scream, the title, comes from the Edward Munch painting. It's not the same positioning of the bodies, but it's that idea. And then in other senses, he takes actual positions of bodies in classical paintings and then redeploys them into the present. So even when he's looking at classical themes, he's usually showing up-to-date, modern, contemporary people wearing contemporary clothes. So what he's done to expand the painters in his field is he brings in real-life models. He sets them up in these very specific positions with very specific clothing, and he pays careful attention to regalia and what people are wearing. And then he photographs them. And then he projects them onto the wall because his paintings are huge. They cannot be hidden away for the most part. And he works on, well, first he'll have done many sketches and many drafts himself, but then when he does the main large one, he might do the faces or work on details, but he has these apprentice painters actually fill in all the rest of the parts. So it's not just Kent Monkman producing these works, it's a whole cadre of people being brought along too and learning these skills.
And that's very traditional itself, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Michelangelo did not carve all of those statues or paint all of those paintings on his own, right? So yeah.
It also speaks back to this idea that a real artist should have a signature that's signed at the bottom of a painting. When we think about non-Western art, often art historians 50 years ago didn't consider them art because they weren't signed. It wasn't about who made them, it was about their function within the culture. But he's showing that you can have something made by multiple hands, but still be art and still be functional.
Right, right. Okay, great. There's lots of questions. So I'm going to take some from the audience. Okay, first one is an easy one. They're wondering who wrote the book that accompanies the show.
Yes, Kent Monkman has been working with a writer named Giselle Gordon for years. And so they together, she's the writer, but I think they together brainstorm and created the voice of Mischief. And not only that, so you can either look online at this, I guess we're calling it the guide for this exhibit, or you can buy it for $5, but they are working on a non-excerpted, a full memoirs of Mischief while we speak. And I believe it's almost in its final version. I think it's hundreds of pages long, and that will be available to purchase. So down the road. So the full history through the eyes of the trickster, traveler, gender-bending Mischief is coming with Giselle Gordon.
Okay, so another question, and by the way, please do pick up the books. They're really beautiful, and they do feed back into the museum's coffers to do programming like this. So Jennifer, you mentioned the vanishing Indian in one of the paintings, and we have a guest who was wondering if there was a reference to Edward Curtis, either in language or artistic style in the exhibit.
Yes, but not explicitly. In fact, I've heard Kent Monkman say that Edward Curtis was sort of the inspiration for him creating Mischief, because some of it, and I believe he first created her back in around 2004. So she's getting around, this lady. And the reason why it relates to Edward Curtis is, of course, he was a photographer, very much controlling the images of Indigenous people across North America, putting them in wigs and dressing them up in ways that he wanted to perceive them. And Mischief was basically, some of the early paintings are Mischief painting non-Indigenous colonizers or RCMP or cowboys from her perspective. So doing what the camera in Edward Curtis's hands or what the paint in George Catlin's hands did to the Indigenous people. So it was his way of reversing the gaze and the power structure. In fact, Kent Monkman even has films where Mischief comes in, I'm sorry, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a film at the McMichael where she comes in on a white horse, dressed out like Cher, and then forces these very blonde Euro-Canadian types to be painted and to be taken advantage of by her as the painter and as the gaze. So he's definitely thinking about Edward Curtis. Good question.
All right, points. Okay, next question speaks to somebody referencing Picasso in some of his paintings and recognizing that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so Kent Monkman not only does paintings, not only curates exhibits, including historic objects in museums, and not only does these short films, but he also does performance pieces. So if you've been so lucky to see Kent Monkman, I had the absolute privilege of seeing him perform what's called the Casualties of Modernity. And in it, Mischief plays a nurse, and she goes through the history of Western art history. And it's set in a hospital. And so it goes through these different stages of art history. And the one with Picasso, with Cubism, which of course was supposedly based on primitivist art, primitivism, they wheel out a hospital bed, and in it is this flattened person that, you know, has no life to them. They've died. The casualties of modernity, the casualties of modernity. And then he goes back, Mischief, well, Kent Monkman goes back as Mischief in this nurse's outfit and says, can I just see that representational classical image again? And out wheels this real person outlined as if they're carved in marble, who gets up and dances with Mischief naked off to the outside. And so I believe there's a film of this. And so it's basically Kent Monkman's take on the fact that he just doesn't like modern art. That's not contemporary art, that's modern art. And I think all that goes with this idea of modern art history is this idea of industrialization, of Europeans taking over the New World. So he's pushing back through showing representations of modern art in the negative in his paintings. And you'll see that throughout the exhibit, and definitely in the final chapter where you see images of women depicted in the Picasso-esque flattened style, which really are seen, interpreted as unhealthy or sick or in need of life.
Yeah. And that answers a few people's questions. So I'll leave that there. So we have another question that is kind of a statement as well, but you might have something to add. It says, this exhibit disrupts our Eurocentrism by making familiar images, plains of Abraham, Fathers of Confederation, seem strange and alien, forcing us settlers to see how our narratives of progress and modernity are implicated in unimaginable tragedy and injustice. How does he represent reconciliation and the pathway forward?
Excellent, well spoken, well said, well written. I've heard him speak about reconciliation. And of course, this exhibit was being put together right when those calls to action came out in 2015 as a result of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Kent Monkman, as many Indigenous people that I've spoken with here in British Columbia and elsewhere, is worried about reconciliation, that how is reconciliation going to happen in Canada if we don't have this recognition of the violence and the dispossession that's happened over these 150 plus years? And so his answer is really that he hopes this exhibit will allow Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, to realize that restitution has to happen if there's going to be reconciliation. So it isn't enough just to say, you're right, horrible history, we're really sorry, can we move ahead now? Being sorry isn't enough. I really see this exhibit as a call to activism on all of our parts, to say, what can we do to correct these wrongs? Yeah. And we all play our part in that.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. I mean, Kent Monkman isn't flying in with the answer, but he realized in doing the research for this particular exhibit how little of this history of Indigenous Canadian interaction is being taught in the schools. Though I think it's changing. I do think it's changing. And I think this awareness is becoming more and more to fruition. And I think these kind of exhibits are making people more aware, and they're doing it exactly through what this questioner said, which is about making you uncomfortable, unsettling what you thought was true, and forcing you to look in different ways, because we all have this myth of the creation of Canada, and we need to look at it more closely.
Yeah. And I think that's actually a really amazing place to leave it. That's, I think, what we might want to leave our audience with. Jennifer, you've done an incredible job. Thank you so much for helping us to understand this incredible collection. Please, anybody who hasn't come to see the show, do come and see it. It's a very safe environment. We all wear masks. You'll wear a mask. We make sure that there aren't very many people in the space at once. So it's a very unique opportunity to see a show like this and really feel like you're able to take your time and view it almost as if the museum is all to yourself. So please come out, have a look. We're always around the museum. Thank you so much for coming out and staying in and listening to our first public tour with Jennifer Kramer. Again, thank you to Ria Saxena. And of course, thank you to the Kent Monkman Studio and Kent Monkman himself for allowing us to display this incredible body of work.
And can I add, it's there until January 3rd.